I never imagined that a single unplanned stop at my wife's office would unravel the life I thought I understood. If anyone had told me even one day earlier that the world I'd built for nearly 3 decades could collapse in the span of a single afternoon, I would have laughed it off. I believed in stability, in routine, in trust. I believed in my wife. And that Thursday in late October, the beginning of all this, started with a simple thought: maybe she's hungry. My name is Gerald Turner, I'm 56 years old, and until that day, I lived with the quiet confidence of a man who thought he'd chosen well, and been loved well in return. Lauren had always been dedicated to her job. 15-hour days weren't unusual for her, especially since she became the CEO of Brightspan Dynamics, a company that lived and breathed deadlines. I used to joke that she kept the world running while I balanced books in my comfortable little accounting practice. We had our rhythm. She was the high-powered executive saving the planet one meeting at a time, and I was the steady husband who made sure dinner wasn't burned and the bills were paid on time. That morning, she bolted out the door in such a rush that she left her coffee unfinished. That tiny detail tugged at me. Lauren never forgot her coffee. So I thought surprising her with her favorite latte and a homemade turkey sandwich would make her smile. I arrived downtown around lunchtime, stepping into the tall glass building that housed Brightspan's headquarters. The sun hit the steel and windows just right, making it shine like a monument to success. I walked inside carrying that brown paper bag full of good intentions, feeling slightly out of place in a lobby full of people in tailored suits. The receptionist pointed me toward the security desk, and that was where the small cracks in my life first appeared. There was a sign behind the guard's counter: "Authorized personnel only beyond this point." The guard himself was a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, his name tag reading Winston. He gave me a polite nod as I approached, but the confidence I'd walked in with seemed to evaporate under the sterile glow of the lobby lights. I told him, "Good afternoon. I'm here to see Lauren Turner. I'm her husband." Even saying the word husband warmed me a bit. For 28 years, that word had fit me perfectly. But Winston's eyebrows knit together in a way that made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. He scanned me, almost apologetically, before letting out a short, confused chuckle. "Sir, you're saying you're the CEO's husband?" "Yes," I said, smiling through the sudden knot in my throat. "Gerald Turner. I brought her lunch." Winston blinked, then shook his head lightly with a bewildered smile, like I had just told him I was the King of England. "Sir, I see her husband every day. In fact," he turned and lifted his hand, pointing toward the revolving doors behind me. "There he is right now." And I turned. And that was the moment my life split cleanly in two. A tall man in a charcoal suit came striding briskly toward us. Confident. Young enough to still seem hungry, but old enough to command a room. His shoes shone brighter than anything I owned. His navy tie looked like it had been tied by someone who understood power. There was an ease to his walk, a certainty I envied instantly. I recognized him before the guard said a single word. "That's Mr. Stone," Winston said casually. "He comes in almost every day to see her. Ethan Stone." I'd heard Lauren mention him countless times, her vice president. Dedicated. Brilliant. Indispensable. I thought those were just professional compliments. Apparently, they were the kind of compliments a woman gives a man she shares her life with. Ethan gave Winston a friendly nod on his way through. "Afternoon, Win. Lauren needs those files by 2 o'clock. "Already up there waiting for you, sir." "Sir." And then Ethan turned to look at me. Not puzzled, not curious. Just knowing. His gaze met mine like he was measuring how much I knew, how much I suspected, and whether I would cause a scene. My voice almost cracked as I forced out, "You must be Ethan." He extended a hand that I didn't take. "And you are?" "Gerald," I said. "A friend of the family." Friend of the family. The words tasted like sand. But the alternative, telling him who I really was, felt too explosive for that marble lobby. Ethan gave a polite smile that stopped just short of reaching his eyes. "Lauren's in meetings all day. I'll make sure she gets whatever you're dropping off." I handed over the coffee and sandwich with a numbness that didn't make sense yet. When I got back to my car, the world was blurry. I don't remember opening the door or sitting in the driver's seat. I just remember my phone buzzing with a message from Lauren. Running late again tonight, love. Don't wait up. Don't wait up. I drove home like someone piloting a body he no longer recognized. The houses blurred together, the streetlights smeared into lines, and the steering wheel felt foreign beneath my grip. When I parked outside our home, our beautiful brick home with trimmed hedges and a porch swing Lauren insisted on painting navy last summer, I felt a strange duality. It looked exactly the same. But I didn't. Inside, the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt staged. It felt hollow. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sandwich Lauren never received, and wondered how long I'd been living in a version of my life that wasn't real. The Lauren who kissed me goodbye every morning, whose laugh echoed in every room of our house, was she even mine anymore? Or had she slowly drifted into someone else's world while I sat here oblivious, content, trusting? That night when she walked in, 9:32 on the dot, I watched her differently. She smiled the same smile, loosened her bun the same way she always did, kissed me on the cheek like always. But I felt her movements like needles poking through my memory. How much of this was real? How much was practiced? When she said, "How was your day?" I almost told her everything. I almost confronted her. But something whispered, "Not yet. Not until you understand the full truth." And that whisper saved me. Because the truth wasn't just an affair. It was worse. Much, much worse. Over the next 3 days, my world peeled back layer by layer, like old wallpaper hiding mildew underneath. And what I discovered wasn't an accident, a mistake, or a moment of weakness. It was a design. A plan. A second life constructed in the shadows of my trust. I would have forgiven an affair. I truly believe that. But what she did wasn't infidelity, it was architecture. She was building a future without me while still using me to fund it. The next morning, while Lauren left for work with a quick kiss and a distracted, "Have a good day," I sat at the kitchen table staring at her favorite mug. The one with the faint chip on the rim. The one I'd washed 100 times after her late-night coffee sessions. Something inside me began stitching itself into resolve. By noon, I was searching through drawers, not snooping, not invading privacy, but investigating a life I suddenly realized I was only a guest in. Her receipts. Her emails. Her calendar. And slowly, horrifyingly, the truth emerged like bruises forming beneath the surface. Dinner receipts from nights she told me she was working with clients. Hotel bookings for executive summits that didn't exist. Recurring appointments marked team building that involved only her and Ethan. But the worst came when I found the key. A key to an apartment I'd never seen. And when I drove to Harbor Ridge Luxury Residences and watched Ethan walk into Building B with a grocery bag in hand, humming like a man coming home, something inside me cracked. The key fit apartment 214 perfectly. And what I found inside would turn the strongest stomach. Photos of them together. Her perfume on the nightstand. Her clothes in the closet. Her handwriting on a folder labeled Long-Term Transition Plan. Inside were printed emails between Lauren and a divorce attorney, negotiating how to replace me smoothly, cleanly, quietly. She'd spent 2 years preparing to leave me. 2 years manipulating narratives to make herself the victim. 2 years using my income to fund her second household. 2 years treating me like a temporary inconvenience in her story. I sat in that apartment, her other home, until the sun dipped behind the city and the streetlights flickered on. And then I knew. I wasn't the husband. I was the placeholder. And placeholders can be removed. This was only the beginning. I stayed in that apartment far longer than I intended, long enough to memorize the contours of the life my wife was living without me. It was decorated in a modern style. Sleek lines, minimalist shelves, expensive art pieces she claimed she never liked whenever I suggested similar ones for our home. There were books on the coffee table about leadership retreats, travel guides for places she'd never mentioned wanting to visit with me, and a stack of mail addressed to Ethan and Lauren Stone. Stone. My wife had been using his last name. I walked through every room like a ghost haunting a life that should have been mine. In the bedroom closet, their clothes hung side by side. Her dresses, ones I'd never seen, his suits, ties, and workout gear. A drawer full of her jewelry, meticulously arranged. Her favorite perfume sitting on the dresser. Even her slippers were there, The same fuzzy cream-colored pair she used to wear at home, now placed neatly at the foot of a bed I never knew she slept in. The bathroom struck me hardest. 2 toothbrushes. 2 sets of towels. Her skincare products, the one she said she stopped using because they were too expensive, lined up next to his shaving cream. Nothing about it was temporary. It wasn't a fling. It wasn't an escape. It was a duplicate life. A fully furnished second marriage. On the kitchen counter, under a small stack of mail, I found the most damning folder yet. Inside were documents outlining a timeline for dissolving our marriage. Not with cruelty, not with anger, but with strategic precision. She was planning to file for divorce after the holidays, citing emotional incompatibility, a growing sense of disconnection, and my supposed neglect of the relationship. She planned to keep the house. She planned to keep her retirement funds. She planned to leave me with the responsibility for debts I didn't even know we had. And there it was, bolded on the final page. Recommended approach: establish a documented pattern of spouse's emotional withdrawal to strengthen primary custody of assets and maintain narrative consistency. Narrative consistency. My 28 years of love had been reduced to a narrative she needed to manage. I snapped photos of everything, every email, every receipt, every calendar entry, every legal note. When I left that apartment, I walked out with a weight in my chest heavier than anything I'd ever carried. But that weight wasn't helplessness. It was clarity. When I got home, Lauren arrived shortly after. She breezed through the door with that same warm, familiar smile, her eyes tired from a long day. She kissed my cheek, told me about meetings, deadlines, and how exhausted she was. And I played along. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to confide in her, to ask about her day, to offer support. Instead, I watched her with the eyes of someone finally seeing the truth. Every word she said, every gesture, every sigh, I analyzed like evidence in a case. Her lies weren't sloppy, they were works of art. Seamless. Practiced. Delivered with the conviction of someone who believed in her ability to maintain 2 lives indefinitely. But Ethan had made one mistake. He looked me in the eyes that day in the lobby. And he knew exactly who I was. But he didn't know what I was capable of when pushed. The next morning, I pretended to head to work. Instead, I drove to the one place Lauren would never expect me to go, her office. Not the Brightspan headquarters, but the law office she'd been contacting. Her divorce lawyer. I sat in the parking lot, watching as people filtered in and out. I imagined Lauren sitting in one of those rooms, carefully crafting a case against me with a professional who had no idea she was lying through her teeth. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, demand respect, demand truth, but I didn't. Emotion couldn't win this. Rage couldn't win this. Only strategy could. Only planning. Only patience. And I had 3 days' worth of photographs, documents, and evidence that she had no idea I possessed. That night, Lauren came home late again. Her hair was slightly mussed. Not messy, just touched, lived in. The way hair looks when someone runs their fingers through it affectionately. She made herself tea and leaned against the counter, telling me about back-to-back meetings. I watched her talk, watched her sip her chamomile tea, watched her settle into the couch like nothing in the world was wrong. And for a moment, just one, grief washed over me. I loved this woman. Or rather, I loved who I thought she was. But she didn't love me. She loved a version of life where I didn't exist. The next morning, I sat at our dining table, going through our financial statements. Years of trust had made me oblivious to where our money was going. Lauren handled most of the finances. She made more, she spent more. I never questioned her. I thought trust was the foundation of marriage. But trust without awareness is blindness. Page after page, I found charges that made no sense. Fancy restaurants we never went to. Hotel stays I never accompanied her on. Gifts she never gave me. Trips she never mentioned. Subscription services we never used. Withdrawals from our savings for miscellaneous expenses. Payments to an interior designer I'd never heard of, clearly for their apartment. And worst of all, she'd been slowly moving funds out of our joint accounts and into one under her name only. By the time I finished, the person I'd been at the beginning of the week no longer existed. I was done being quiet. I was done being trusting. I was done being replaced. When Lauren walked into the kitchen the following Saturday morning, hair loose, robe tied around her waist, looking like a woman at peace in a life built on lies, I placed the manila folder of evidence on the table. She froze. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. She didn't stammer. No, she went still like a predator caught mid-step. Behind her calm exterior, I saw the calculations beginning. She didn't even bother pretending. "How much do you know?" she asked. That was it. Not, "What is this?" Not, "I can explain." Not, "This isn't what it looks like." Just pure, clean, businesslike damage control. "Everything," I said. Her jaw tightened, but she stayed composed. "Sit down. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." And I realized right then that she'd never been flustered by me. Not once. Not in 28 years. Because she'd never seen me as someone capable of challenging her. She had no idea who I really was. We talked for over an hour, if you could call it talking. It was more like negotiations. She told me our marriage had run its natural course. She told me she'd changed as a person. She told me I deserved peace. She told me she and Ethan had a connection that couldn't be ignored. Connection. She used the word connection to describe the affair she'd hidden for 2 years. When I asked if she loved him, she didn't hesitate. Yes. When I asked if she ever truly loved me, her silence said everything she didn't. She'd outgrown me. She'd rewritten history to suit her future. But she underestimated the one thing she'd never bothered to learn about me. I do not lose quietly. By Monday morning, I was sitting across from a divorce lawyer I chose myself, a firm with more bite than hers, with attorneys who despised manipulation and knew how to dismantle deceit. And I came prepared. Every receipt, every email, every timeline, every transfer, every lie. Piece by piece, I laid out the truth Lauren thought she'd buried. My lawyer stared at the pile, then at me. "Mr. Turner," he said slowly, "your wife planned this divorce like a corporate takeover. But you came armed like a forensic accountant. This is going to turn the entire case upside down." And it did. The coming months were a quiet war. A war Lauren never expected me to win. A war she never even expected me to fight. And the moment I decided to expose the professional misconduct she thought she'd hidden from her company, that was the moment everything changed. Not just for her. For both of us. Forever. The morning I filed for divorce, something inside me shifted. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the slow, steady force of a tide turning. I walked out of my lawyer's office with a copy of the petition in hand, and for the first time in months, the air felt breathable. Not lighter. No, nothing about this process was light, but clearer. Clean. As if I had finally stepped out of a room that had been filling with smoke for years without my noticing. Lauren had always been the planner in our marriage, the strategist, the visionary. She believed she could predict every outcome. She believed in controlling narratives, controlling environments, controlling people. She assumed I would react exactly how she needed me to, quietly, passively, with minimal disruption to the image she wanted to present to the world. But she never anticipated that I would fight with facts. She never expected me to gather evidence. She never imagined I would expose her duplicity, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. And she definitely didn't anticipate that her own corporate world, the world she lived for, would become the battlefield. I didn't set out to destroy her career. That wasn't my intention. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen in that folder at her second apartment. The proposed restructuring of Brightspan Dynamics. The transfer of roles to Ethan without board approval. The fact that she'd positioned her romantic partner to take over responsibilities he had no official authorization to handle. The integrity of my own life was crumbling. I wasn't going to let her build a fraudulent empire on top of that rubble. So I did what any responsible professional would do. I informed the board. Not with venom. Not with emotion. Just facts. Cold, objective, undeniable facts. Richard Langley, the board chair, listened with the quiet attention of a man who'd heard many confessions in his long career. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question my motives. He simply asked for documentation, thanked me for bringing it to him, and promised a governance review. Lauren didn't know any of this when she got home that night. She didn't know she was hours away from the beginning of her downfall. She came through the door late, shoulders tense, heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. Her face was pulled tight in a way I recognized immediately. She was stressed, angry, edges fraying. She must have gotten the call. She walked into the living room slowly, as if a storm was building behind her eyes. She didn't sit. She didn't take off her coat. She just looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and dread. "What did you do?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. "I closed the book I wasn't really reading." "What do you mean?" She took a step forward, jaw clenched. "The board. They called an emergency governance review. They're questioning recent restructuring decisions. They want documentation. They want explanations. They want clarity." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "They've never questioned me like this. Not once." I didn't answer. I just let her stare at me, searching for confirmation. "You told them," she said finally. "You told them something." "I shared factual information," I said softly. "Nothing more." Her breath caught, just slightly, but enough for me to see the fear behind her composure. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my reputation? To my job? To everything I've built?" "I know what you did to our marriage," I replied. "To our home. To my life." She flinched, barely, but it was there. "This isn't the same," she snapped. "No," I agreed. "This is worse. Because you didn't just betray me. You misled your entire company." She stared at me for a long, heavy moment, and for the first time since this began, I saw something real flicker in her expression. Not guilt. Not remorse. But vulnerability. The kind that comes when a person realizes the structure they built on a foundation of lies is beginning to shake. She sank slowly onto the couch, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "I didn't think you'd fight me," she said quietly. "That," I replied, "is the problem." The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. Lauren left early every morning, hair perfectly styled, suit crisp, shoulders back, but her confidence was an act now. I saw through it. So did her co-workers. The governance review hit the company like a gust of cold wind, and it didn't take long for rumors to spread. People talk. Especially in offices. Especially when something feels off. Especially when the CEO who seemed indestructible suddenly looked mortal. I wasn't around to see the details, but I heard enough, second-hand whispers from colleagues of hers who still assumed I was the oblivious husband she'd painted me to be. According to them, Lauren tried to explain away the restructuring decisions as internal reassignments, but the board wasn't satisfied. They wanted transparency, documentation, official approvals that didn't exist. And then came the worst blow for her, the undisclosed relationship. Ethan and Lauren's affair, something they'd kept carefully hidden in professional circles, became a conflict of interest the moment the governance review began pulling threads. Once the board discovered that Ethan had been living with her and benefiting directly from her decisions, it wasn't just an ethical issue. It was a breach of trust. A liability. A scandal waiting to explode. Ethan was fired within a week. He packed his things. Left the office quietly. Moved back to Denver. Their great love, their carefully curated second life, evaporated the moment pressure touched it. Lauren tried to keep her position. She tried to assert authority. She tried to convince the board she was still the best leader for Brightspan. But damage like that doesn't disappear. They didn't fire her, but they stripped her power. They placed her on probation. They brought in a COO to oversee her work. They cut her travel privileges. They required approval for decisions she once made with a snap of her fingers. She'd gone from being the most powerful woman in the company to being micromanaged like an intern. And for the first time in decades, I saw something in her I'd never seen before. Humility. Or something close to it. Meanwhile, our divorce proceedings progressed. Slowly at first. Then rapidly once her lawyer realized the extent of the evidence I had. The documents she'd prepared to use against me, the narrative of emotional withdrawal, the carefully constructed portrayal of me as the disengaged, passive spouse, crumbled under the weight of her own actions. Financial deception. Infidelity. Misuse of marital funds. A second residence paid with joint resources. Corporate misconduct intertwined with personal betrayal. Her lawyer tried to negotiate. Tried to twist the facts. Tried to salvage her strategy. But the truth was stronger. I wasn't vindictive. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to ruin her life. I wanted fairness. I wanted dignity. I wanted the settlement she'd planned for herself, but built on honesty instead of lies. And ironically, that was exactly what I got. She kept some assets. I kept some. It wasn't perfect, but it was just. The day we signed the final divorce papers, she looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her 49 years. Not defeated. Not angry. Just tired. She whispered, "I never thought this would be how it ended." And I said nothing. Because the truth was, she ended our marriage long before I discovered it. All I did was refuse to be silent about it. Weeks passed. Then months. I moved into my own apartment, a place smaller than our house, but full of air I could breathe without the weight of someone else's deception. I cooked dinners for one. Read books without feeling like I was disappointing someone. Slept in a bed that held no whispers of betrayal. And slowly, unbelievably, peace began to return. Lauren retreated into her work. Into damage control. Into trying to rebuild a life she shattered with her own choices. I retreated into something else entirely. Myself. The version of me that existed long before Lauren's expectations and manipulation. The version of me who believed in honesty and stability, not because they were boring, but because they were foundations worth building lives on. The version of me who never stopped being loyal, even when loyalty was used against him. It took time, longer than I expected, but eventually, someone entered my life who saw value in the very things Lauren dismissed. Her name was Margaret. She didn't want a partner who climbed corporate ladders or chased global success. She wanted someone who listened, someone who cared, someone capable of finding beauty in the ordinary moments of life. She found joy in quiet mornings, shared meals, simple walks, and thoughtful conversations. She found joy in me. And I found something I didn't think I ever would again. Partnership without pretense. One soft Sunday evening, months after we'd begun seeing each other, I sat on my apartment balcony reading while the last light of day draped the city in gold. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, her voice came through. Lauren's. She sounded subdued. Almost fragile. "Gerald," she said, "I just wanted to apologize. Not for the affair. Not for the apartment. Not for the lies. For everything." I listened in silence. She confessed that after Ethan's departure, after her demotion, after losing the stability she'd taken for granted, she realized something she'd been too blind to see during our marriage. "You were good to me," she said. "And I didn't appreciate it. I kept chasing something bigger, something shinier, something that made me feel powerful. And when I found someone who fed that part of me, I convinced myself it meant our marriage was over. But it wasn't you who changed. It was me." I closed my eyes, listening to her shifting in what I imagined was a lonely apartment. A quiet space filled with the echoes of decisions she could no longer justify. "I thought ambition made me strong," she continued quietly. "But loyalty, love, those are the things I should have valued. I didn't know that until it was too late." I let her words drift into the air. Then I said, "I hope you find peace, Lauren." And I meant it. I released the anger the moment I realized she consumed too much of my life already. She didn't deserve more of my energy, more of my time, more of my heart. She never called again. And I didn't need her to. Because I'd learned something powerful in those months. Freedom sometimes comes disguised as heartbreak. And losing someone who never valued you is not a loss. It's liberation. The months after my divorce were some of the strangest I'd ever lived through, quiet in a way that felt deeply unfamiliar. For nearly 3 decades, my life had revolved around someone else's schedule, someone else's needs, someone else's ambitions. Now, I woke up in a small apartment that didn't require me to tiptoe around stress or exhaustion or unspoken resentment. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was peaceful, like the calm surface of water after a storm. At first, I didn't know what to do with that peace. I'd grown accustomed to living around Lauren's orbit, adjusting myself to fit whatever version of life she deemed acceptable. I didn't realize how much I'd shrunk over the years until I suddenly had space to stretch again. It felt strange to reclaim my own habits, cooking breakfast the way I liked it, reading in the evenings without feeling guilty, or simply taking a walk without checking whether she needed the car. Little by little, I relearned myself. And in that rediscovery, I found healing. I also discovered something else. People had opinions about what happened between Lauren and me. Not because I told them, I didn't. But word spreads. Colleagues, acquaintances, neighbors, all had their own versions of the story, half-truths mixed with speculation. Some offered sympathy when they saw me alone at the grocery store. Others expressed disbelief, as if they couldn't imagine Lauren doing something so calculated. A few people even admitted they'd noticed changes in her years ago but assumed everything was fine because we always appeared stable. But appearances are the easiest things to fabricate. What mattered most was that I didn't let other people's interpretations rewrite my experience again. No one knew the full truth, not even Lauren. Only I knew the extent of what she took, how deeply she carved into my trust, how sharply she severed the man I once was from the man I needed to become. And that man, the one I became, started to live again. The first time Margaret invited me to dinner at her place, I nearly declined. Not because I didn't like her. I did, more than I wanted to admit at the time. But part of me still felt tethered to a version of myself that existed in Lauren's shadow. Accepting an invitation from someone kind, gentle, genuinely interested in me felt like stepping into a territory I hadn't earned. But Margaret wasn't like Lauren. She paid attention, not to what she could extract from me, but to who I really was. She asked how my day was and listened. She made a homemade stew that filled her kitchen with warmth, and she served it with fresh bread she'd baked that morning, laughing about how it didn't rise properly. She wasn't trying to impress me. She was simply sharing her life in the most honest way. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself enjoy it. We didn't talk about Lauren that night. Or the divorce. Or anything heavy. We talked about books. About food. About music from the 70s. About her late husband, Thomas, and how he used to play the guitar badly but with passion. She spoke of him with affection rather than bitterness, and that told me more about her heart than anything else could have. Being with her felt grounding. There was no performance. No expectations. No manipulation hidden beneath soft words. Just two people sharing a moment. Weeks passed, and Margaret and I found a natural rhythm. Slow, unforced, comfortable. She appreciated the little things I offered, a repaired cabinet door in her kitchen, my habit of bringing pastries on Sunday mornings, the way I remembered details she mentioned casually. And I appreciated her presence, steady and warm. She didn't need me to be impressive, or ambitious, or extraordinary. She simply needed me to be present. Something Lauren never asked for. Something Lauren never wanted. One Tuesday afternoon, several months after the divorce, I stopped by a hardware store near my apartment to pick up a few supplies for Margaret's garden. As I walked out, carrying a small bag of tools, I saw someone sitting on a bench near the entrance, her posture hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lauren. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in the way a person does after losing battles no one expected them to fight. Her hair wasn't styled as carefully as before, and her tailored coat seemed too big on her frame. She wasn't scanning the crowd with her usual confident poise. She was staring down at the concrete like she was trying to find answers in the cracks. For a moment, I considered walking right past her. Pretending not to see her. Pretending she no longer existed. But something, some old instinct, made my steps slow, then halt. She looked up and met my eyes. And there was no anger there. No entitlement. Just exhaustion. We stood there for a few seconds, an invisible timeline stretching between us. The years we spent together, the lies she wove, the damage she caused, the man I used to be under her shadow, and the man I had become without it. Gerald, she said softly. Lauren. She took a shaky breath. I heard you've been doing well. I'm managing. She nodded slowly, absorbing the words. 4 years, I would have softened them, reassured her, comforted her even in her wrongness. But not anymore. Now, I let silence sit where it belonged. I'm not here to ask for anything, she said. I just needed to see you. Needed to see if you were okay. "I'm fine," I replied honestly. Her lips trembled, not from tears, but from the sudden realization that my life had continued without her. That I wasn't broken. That I wasn't begging for closure or answers. That I didn't need her anymore. "I lost my position," she admitted, voice low. "They didn't fire me, but they stripped almost everything from me. It's humiliating." I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't say, "You brought it on yourself," even though she had. Instead, I simply said, "I'm sorry you're going through that." Not out of obligation. Not out of pity. But because compassion isn't something that disappears when love does. "I know you are," she whispered. "Because that's who you've always been. Better than I deserved." A moment passed, a quiet acknowledgement of what we'd been, what we'd lost, and what we'd become. And then she said, "I hope you're happy now." "Truly." "I am," I said. Her eyes softened with acceptance. And for the first time in years, she looked at me not as someone she needed to manipulate, not as someone she saw as beneath her ambitions, but as someone she once loved, flawed, steady, human. She stood up, brushed off her coat, and gave me one last, small smile. "Goodbye, Gerald." "Goodbye, Lauren." We walked in opposite directions without looking back. And as I drove home, everything that had once felt like loss suddenly felt like freedom. Later that evening, I sat with Margaret on my balcony, the night air cool around us. She poured us each a cup of tea, the soft glow of string lights reflecting in her eyes. Without prompting, without knowing anything about what had happened earlier that day, she placed her hand on mine. "You look peaceful," she said gently. "I feel peaceful," I replied. And I meant it. In that simple moment, her hand warm over mine, the city humming softly below, the world quiet and still, I realized something profound. Sometimes the person you spend decades with isn't the one meant to stay. Sometimes the real story of your life begins only after you think the book is closed. And sometimes the greatest freedom you'll ever know is walking away from someone who never valued your truth. I never reclaimed the man I was before Lauren. I became someone better. More honest. More grounded. More aware. More alive. And in that stillness, I understood something Lauren never could. Stability isn't boring. Stability is safety. Stability is love. Stability is a home that can't be bought with ambition or replaced with excitement. Stability is the foundation for a life that doesn't collapse when a storm hits. Lauren chased storms because they made her feel powerful. I embraced calm because it made me feel whole. And in that calm, I found a future built not on manipulation or performance, but on truth. A future I never knew I deserved, until the day Lauren lost me. In the months that followed, my life settled into a rhythm I never knew I needed. Not the rigid, unspoken schedule Lauren built our marriage around, but a gentler one, fluid, forgiving, driven by intention rather than expectation. I discovered how quiet a morning could be when it wasn't shadowed by someone else's ambitions. I learned that a home didn't need to be grand or spotless to be comforting. It only needed to be honest. I also learned something else, something I hadn't realized during all the years I was married. Peace isn't the absence of noise. Peace is the absence of pretending. For nearly 3 decades, I'd lived in a quiet house filled with unspoken truths and carefully curated smiles. Now I lived in a modest apartment filled with laughter, mismatched mugs, and a half-finished puzzle on my coffee table. Nothing was perfect, but nothing was fake. Margaret and I grew closer in ways that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Our relationship wasn't about filling voids or healing wounds, it was about recognizing each other's humanity. She never compared herself to my past, never tried to replace anything I'd lost. She simply brought warmth into my life, the kind that felt like home in a way I hadn't experienced in years. One evening, she asked me a question that made me pause. "Do you ever miss her?" We were sitting on her couch, her cat curled on her lap, my hand around a warm mug of chamomile tea. I took a breath. "I miss who I thought she was." Margaret nodded gently, as if that answer made all the sense in the world. "And who do you think she was?" she asked softly. "A woman I loved," I said. "But also a woman who never truly existed. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't anger. It was simply truth. For years, I projected qualities onto Lauren that she didn't possess. loyalty, vulnerability, empathy, sacrifice. I loved the version of her I believed in, not the version who chose ambition over honesty, secrecy over partnership. There was a time when admitting that would have devastated me. Now, it felt like clarity. The man I used to be, gentle to a fault, endlessly forgiving, eager to avoid conflict, would have carried Lauren's mistakes on his back like they were his own. But the man I'd become understood something crucial. You cannot blame yourself for someone else's deception. You cannot save a marriage that only one person is faithful to. You cannot rewrite a history that was never yours to begin with. Margaret squeezed my hand lightly. "I'm glad you're free of her," she said. "I am too," I said. "More than I ever thought I could be." A few weeks later, I received a letter from a mutual friend of Lauren's, a man named Harold who used to host dinner parties we'd attend once or twice a year. He was one of the few people who'd always treated me kindly, even when Lauren seemed impatient with my quiet nature. Inside the envelope was a brief, handwritten note. "Gerald, I wanted you to know that Lauren is no longer working at Brightspan. She stepped down last month. I won't pretend to know the details, but I hope this news brings you some closure. Wishing you well." I sat with that letter for a long time. Lauren had stepped down. The woman who once lived for power, influence, and corporate respect had let it all go. Whether she resigned before she was pushed or she simply couldn't sustain the pressure anymore, I didn't know. And strangely, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt nothing. She was no longer a part of my life, no longer part of my thoughts, no longer part of the inner landscape where she once took up so much space. Her downfall wasn't my victory. My freedom was. One afternoon in early autumn, almost a year after the day the security guard mistook another man for my wife's husband, I took a walk through a park near my apartment. The trees had begun to turn shades of amber and gold, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. I watched a father teaching his daughter how to ride a bike, a couple sharing a blanket on the grass, an elderly man feeding ducks near a pond. Life continued. People carried stories I would never know, battles I would never fight, loves I would never feel. And I realized, with a surprising sense of comfort, that my story was no longer defined by betrayal. It was defined by rebirth. I found a bench beneath a sycamore tree and sat down, letting the sunlight warm my face. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds around me. Children laughing, dogs barking, the wind whispering through branches. And for the first time since everything happened, I let myself think of Lauren without pain. Not with longing. Not with anger. Just with acceptance. She was a chapter in my life, a long one, a significant one, but a chapter nonetheless. And chapters end. That doesn't make them meaningless. It simply means the story continues. As I sat there, I felt someone slip their hand into mine. I opened my eyes and saw Margaret standing beside me, her smile soft and understanding. "Ready to head home?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Let's stay a little longer." She sat beside me, leaning her head on my shoulder. Together, we watched the leaves fall, each one drifting softly to the ground, letting go of the branches that once held them. Nature never clings to what has outlived its purpose. Maybe that was the lesson I needed all along. Margaret spoke after a long silence. "You seem lighter these days." "I am," I said. "I think I finally understand that what happened wasn't an ending." "What was it then?" she asked. "A beginning." Margaret's smile deepened. "And are you happy with where it's going?" I looked at her, at the woman who had walked into my life without expectation, without judgment, without conditions. "Yes," I said. "I'm happy." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the path, and I felt the world shift softly around me. The world I once feared would collapse under the weight of Lauren's betrayal. But I survived. I rebuilt. I rediscovered a man who deserved more than to be someone's placeholder. As we walked home together, hand in hand, I realized something that felt like the final piece clicking into place. Sometimes you lose everything you thought mattered, only to gain everything you truly needed. And that, ultimately, was the story I never expected to live. A story that wasn't about betrayal after all. It was about awakening. It was about rediscovery. It was about learning that love built on truth, quiet, steady, honest truth, is worth more than any illusion of perfection. As we reached my apartment door, I turned the key, opened it, and stepped inside. A small, ordinary space. A place of peace. A place of beginnings. A place built not from lies, but from truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt fully, completely home. A few months later, on a quiet winter morning, I found myself standing at the window of my apartment, watching the first snowfall of the season settle softly across the street. The world looked clean, untouched, like a blank page waiting for someone brave enough to write something new on it. For so many years, I'd woken up feeling like I was living in someone else's story, following someone else's script, adjusting myself to fit someone else's ambition. But that morning, with snow drifting lazily in the pale light, I realized I was fully living in my own life. Margaret came up beside me, still wrapped in the knitted scarf she'd fallen asleep in on the couch. She leaned gently into me, her head resting on my shoulder, her presence warm and easy in a way I never knew I needed. "You're thinking again," she teased softly. I smiled. "Only good thoughts this time." "What kind?" "That I never expected any of this," I said. "Not the hurt. Not the rebuilding. Not you." She slipped her arm through mine, her fingers closing around my hand. "Life doesn't fall apart to punish us, Gerald. Sometimes it falls apart because we're meant to grow in a direction we never would have chosen." I let the words settle inside me. They felt true, not because they erased the pain of what I'd gone through, but because they finally gave meaning to it. If Lauren hadn't betrayed me, if the marriage hadn't collapsed, if that guard hadn't laughed and pointed me toward another man he believed was her husband, I might never have woken up from the life I was sleepwalking through. I might never have found myself. I might never have found peace. I might never have found someone who loved me for who I really was. Margaret nudged the window open just enough for a crisp breath of cold air to sweep through the room. The snowflakes swirled and danced along the sill, melting as they touched the warmth inside. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It really is." We stood there together, the world hushed around us, wrapped in that strange, comforting silence that only winter brings. A silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of possibility, of renewal, of second chances. It struck me then how ironic it was. I had spent decades believing stability came from holding on. From staying still. From preserving what I had, even when it no longer fed my soul. But real stability, I'd learned, came from living truthfully. It came from letting go of the life that was killing me slowly, piece by piece, and stepping, cautiously, bravely, into the life waiting beyond it. Margaret's hand squeezed mine. "You ready for breakfast?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, turning from the window. "I think I'm ready for everything." And as we walked into the kitchen together, the snow still falling gently outside, I felt it fully, deep in my chest, warm and steady. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was finally living.